Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Connel Fullenkamp. He's a professor of economics at Duke University. A way to talk about financial market development and regulation of financial markets. So, Connel, thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. If you would, I haven't spoken to tons of economists, and I know some things about finances and fiscal policy, but what's your research and your work about?
So with respect to finance, I do a lot of research on thinking about just financial market development, how and why financial markets develop, and in many cases fail to develop. And that's come out of a lot of the work that I've done with colleagues at the International Monetary Fund. We do training of government officials around the world about financial market development. So we've learned a lot through experience and kind of case studies. And I also do a lot of research on regulation, trying to think about how regulation affects financial markets and trying to think about how to design better regulations. So that's really what the focus of my research.
So what kind of financial markets do you look at? You look at countrywide, worldwide, particular commodities? I mean, what do you focus on?
Sure. Well, we usually look at it country by country, and we look at just about everything we can. If you look at financial market development globally, in most countries, the banking market is fairly well developed. And in fact, in most countries, the banks are kind of the dominant financial institutions. So when we talk about financial market development, we're really talking about trying to develop a bond market, a stock market, and perhaps even derivatives markets. Okay.
So again, is there a particular country that you look at as a model, or do you compare amongst the countries? What's happening financially in the markets? Like,
sure.
What are you trying to figure out?
Sure. Well, we're trying to figure out really, there's a big question of how much or even whether governments can foster financial market development. So, if we take kind of the ideal case is the U.S., we have these really well-developed, really deep, really broad financial markets. And, they didn't come from nowhere. And so we're thinking about the U.S. case and how much that can be replicated, if at all, in other countries. So we're looking at individual countries. We usually look kind of regionally because the economies are sort of similar. So what we do is we try to think about, what have governments tried to do to develop, say, a stock market or a bond market in a particular country, say, like, Thailand or Singapore, and what's been successful and what hasn't, and really what can governments do best to try to facilitate that type of market development. And there are some universalities here. So when I talk about a bond market or a stock market in one corner of the world, say in Southeast Asia, there really are still similarities and lessons to be learned that we can apply in other countries as well, because these countries, are trying to get to the same place. So
when people want to say they want to develop a market, what does that mean? What are the factors they're looking to tell them? Okay, it's better than it was before.
Yeah, so it's pretty easy to tell, right? Because if you have a bond market that's developing, then you have companies that don't have to go to the banks for all of their borrowing needs. They can go to the bond market and issue bonds. So we can look at numbers like just raw issuance of bonds and see how much that's taking off. And similarly, we can look at the number of companies that are listed on a stock market, how much stock is being traded actively. One of the problems of stock markets is that all these countries start stock markets, and they announce them with really big fanfare, and they build them a special stock exchange building, and try to give incentives for the companies in the country to list. And of course, only a few companies actually list on the stock market, and there's virtually no trading on the market. So the market trades, half an hour on 1 day a week, and that's about it. And you really can't say that's a stock market that's really doing anything for the economy, because we want the stock market to actually, provide financing for new companies, and that just isn't going to happen in a lot of countries.
So, with the the coronavirus situation, what do you see it's done to markets? Has it just put them to sleep and now they're waking back up? Has it, obliterated them? Like, has it changed them? What do you see is going on?
Yeah, I think it really came close to obliterating the markets, as you suggested back in March when there was that huge cash crunch. So all of these companies, both in the U.S. and around the world, realized that there could be really negative consequences for cash flow from the coronavirus. So of course, if you look ahead 6 months and you think you're going to be short of cash, the first thing you're going to do is go out and try to borrow more cash. And all of these companies worldwide were scrambling to go to the banks, to tap their credit lines, to go to whatever markets they could to borrow. And those markets were locking up. Literally, they were running out of cash to basically to lend. And in the U.S., a big part of breaking that logjam and getting us back to something closer to normal was the Fed stepping in as not just a lender of last resort anymore, but what we even call a market maker of last resort, meaning that they actually stepped in and bought companies' bonds. And controversially, they said that they would buy even things that were not investment grade. So the markets have come back partly because of the confidence, and a lot because the interest rates are so low these days. So if you can find access to the capital, it's a really good time to borrow if you're a company because you're going to be paying super, super low interest rates.
Do you think in the U.S. the Fed may actually buy equities, or do you think that it doesn't need to intervene much from here? Like, what's your sense of the market right now?
Yeah, the issue of buying equity is really interesting because in some countries we've seen that happen. For example, the Bank of Japan, in order to support the stock market and try to jumpstart the economy, has actually engaged in buying equities. The equity market in the U.S. right now, of course, is on a tear. It took a big blow in March and then has come roaring back. In fact, a lot of people are scratching their heads now because of the amount of gains of the stock market and the amount of trading these days. So I'll say this: I would never rule it out, but I don't think it's likely in the current scenario because there's really nothing to be gained from the Fed stepping in and trying to support the equity market. It's doing just fine. I think there's still likelihood that the Fed will have to step in, perhaps, and support certain types of bond markets, especially I think ones related to commercial real estate, because that is really falling on hard times, of course, because of the big lockdowns and the reluctance of people to go back to work in these office buildings.
So what key metrics do you want to see change in a certain way? For instance, right now in the U.S. economy, and then the government, are there key metrics that they're looking at that they want to see change or improve?
Yeah, I think, obviously they want to see basically consumption come back because that's the big driver in the U.S. and in many, many global markets. They want to see the consumption come back because then that means that people are confident and they're going to, and that's going to drive the business in turn, right? If you have a consumption increase, then businesses are going to say, okay, now I can actually take some funding and engage in some investing. I think that's really what they're looking for these days. The unemployment numbers, since they're a lagging indicator, they're not looking at that as much. Of course, they're paying attention to that because that indicates that people are suffering. But the things they're really looking for are some upturns in not just the borrowing, but really the economic activity that you would undertake in general after the borrowing. So, new housing starts. I think they're really looking at corporate investments. They're really waiting for companies to start sinking their money into risky projects that would indicate, confidence about the future.
What I see that's interesting is like the economic dynamic of the states is changing, or I think will change a lot. Some states are opening up, some are just, sitting there. I don't know what they're doing, but it seems like, ironically, I guess the biggest financial powerhouse states and areas in the U.S. are sitting there not doing much, and then the other ones that aren't known for that are. So I just wonder if there's going to be a big shift of production and commerce and people living and population and all that, and it would change the dynamic of the U.S.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I think it's if we continue like this for 6 more months or a year, I can certainly see that start to happen. The part of the problem, of course, is that so much of this stuff is really deeply sunk investments, and it's not just that they have the capital invested there in buildings and infrastructure and stuff. There are also a lot of people who are tied to working in certain places. I can tell you firsthand, for example, among my students, they're part of the reason they want to go into financial services is because they want the excitement of living in New York. So it's hard. I think it's possible, but it's hard for me to imagine that a transition like that would take place. I mean, if you want an example, what's really pretty interesting to me is to watch what's happening in London, right? London is a huge financial center for Europe. And because of Brexit, there's a big question about what's going to happen to the financial markets in the UK. Are they all is everybody going to pack up and move to Frankfurt or to Paris? And so far, the answer is, well, a few are, but there's still a lot of infrastructure in London. There's still a lot of convenience there, and there's still a lot of people who would rather live in London than in Frankfurt.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's true. In England, I guess Brexit was the constant talk, but now it's been quiet on it, because of the coronavirus. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, are there any?
It's just an interesting example. I mean, a lot of the cases that we look at in financial market development, right? It's not like we can't really run controlled experiments, so we use a lot of case studies. So I pay a lot of attention to possible examples that are out there in the markets to try to see what we can glean from them. So that strikes me as a pretty reasonable example.
Well, again, what are you seeing right now? What interesting dynamics do you see that are going on that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think just on the smaller scale, one of the things that I find really fascinating in the past few weeks is the big comeback of stock splits. So in the news, you've heard about Apple splitting its shares 4-for-1, Tesla, I think even a bigger split, I think something like 5-to-1. And this is an activity that companies used to do a lot back in the old days, so to speak. By old days, I mean 15, 20 years ago. And they don't seem to do that anymore. It seems to have really dried up. And yet, out of the blue, two big tech companies announced these big stock splits. So in the past, this was a really huge positive signal to the markets that things are going well for these companies. They would split the stock in order to keep the shares affordable to small investors. The idea is that if you're a small investor, you have to put together a lot of capital to buy the shares because you get the best price on the market by buying 100 shares at a time. So if the company's shares are over $100 a share, you're going to be paying more than 10 grand just to get a reasonable stake in the company. So what companies would do is that they would split their shares and knock the price down to make it affordable to small shareholders. And companies like small shareholders because small shareholders hold the shares for a long time and they don't complain.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? I mean, ideally, rationally, a stock splits, it shouldn't do anything because you have double the number of shares. But, right, if you think about buying a share of Berkshire Hathaway, you're like, holy, it's crazy. Even Berkshire B now.
Yeah, even the B shares are so expensive.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting to me is that in the past 10 years, right, we've gotten to the point where because of the internet, there's not really a big difference in price between buying one share and buying 100 shares. So that takes away some of the rationale for stock splits. And the other thing is that now brokerages are even offering what they call fractional shares. I mean, you could go in and buy, a quarter or even a tenth of a Tesla share. The exchange traded funds have kind of led the way on that, but it didn't seem to a lot of economists, including me, that there was a lot of rationale for stock splits these days. But there may still be a really big rationale for signaling the optimism. So Apple is signaling to its investors, hey, don't worry, we think we still got a lot of upside. And of course, Tesla is trying to signal the same thing.
All right. So what other? What other main dynamics do you see? It seems like the jobs numbers are improving, each month that they release them, which is great. I don't know, where do you see that we're headed maybe over the next 6 months economically in the U.S.?
I think we're in for a really rough and uneven recovery. The problem is that is something I alluded to a couple of minutes ago, which is really it's about confidence. The uncertainty in the economy. And so both financial markets and kind of normal people hate uncertainty. And it really actually puts a lot of cold water on people's activity. And until we can get the uncertainty from the coronavirus and its spread under control, it's going to cause people to really panic at times and throw their plans into reverse. right? So we had this incipient recovery that was starting to happen in April, May, early June, and then the cases start to spike again, and people are worried that it's a second wave or something like that, and so everybody's plans get thrown into reverse. And it's that kind of uncertainty that's really going to prevent people from engaging in all kinds of activities, whether it's shopping or investing or companies, borrowing and spending. So to me, that says we're in for a real rough ride.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Yeah, no, maybe it's worse when you. I know that's true. Uncertainty is terrible. People want certainty, even if it's bad news.
That's right.
I've observed. So
Yeah, if you get bad news, then it becomes a problem to be solved. I mean, if you don't know what could possibly happen, you sit there and your mind, gives you all kinds of terrible scenarios, and it basically paralyzes you. And that's why it's so bad for markets of all kinds.
Yeah, that's true. Do you see certainty bearing out in any other countries that you're looking at? Marker countries that you think will be like bellwethers of what's going to happen in the near future?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to say because China seems to be they claim that they're doing really well with controlling the virus, but I don't know if that's credible or not. Their economy is certainly doing better, but again, it's hard to tell. The data of all kinds out of China is not very reliable. We're seeing a couple of countries in Europe, of course, do really well. Germany is doing relatively well because they've dealt with the virus and they're more of a manufacturing-based economy, and the manufacturing orders are still holding up fairly well. Sweden, of course, is an interesting case because they never completely shut down, and they're kind of middle of the pack in terms of coronavirus experience, but their economy has suffered significantly less than other countries' economies have because of the virus. So those are a couple of bellwether, a couple of countries to watch. And, in the case of Sweden, my personal view is that we should have imitated Sweden at least a little bit more than what we did.
Yeah. Do you think Sweden's even being considered, or it's just kind of being ignored?
Yeah, I think it's really unpopular to talk about Sweden here in the U.S. these days because I think a lot of people expected their virus numbers to really get out of control, and they never did. I mean, they're neither at the top nor the bottom of the standings, so to speak. They're kind of middle of the pack, and they have done better than some countries that locked down hard and worse than others. But there's really there's no strong correlation between the strength of your lockdown and how you fared economically. And I think that a lot of people don't like that, so we don't talk about it that much.
It's kind of terrible to say they don't like that, so then they don't talk about it.
Yeah, well, I think I think unfortunately that is kind of the land that we're living in with respect to that.
I know. It's just why would you cover your eyes and not try to see reality? It's
yeah, I agree. I think especially with just thinking about people doing their everyday normal commerce and business. I think we're starting to see some research in the U.S. that is trying to separate the amount of economic slowdown that it was caused by the government lockdowns themselves versus kind of the voluntary reduction in activity that people would undertake normally. And I saw some number today that indicated it was kind of 60-40, that the government was responsible for 60% of the slowdown and private activity for another 40% of the slowdown. So part of this to me is saying, well, people are at least fairly smart in terms of understanding what these risks are to them, and they will react in fairly prudent ways in many cases. College students notwithstanding, of course.
Yeah. Well, what about the media? I mean, is there, in that calculation, you have government, you have private industry, the media, I don't know, they seem to pull everyone's chain 1,000 times a day.
Yeah, I think
they contribute to it.
Oh yeah, I think the media has gotten a lot of mileage out of being pretty alarmist about this whole thing. And that's too bad. And a lot of people are kind of trying to take advantage of the situation by touting their own opinions as science. I think I've heard, too many people claim that they're following the science when in fact they're just trying to use a quasi-scientific background for their own opinion.
I don't even know what the science is, but it's a nice term that's used.
Of course.
The science, which I don't know what the science is, but
Well, it has a lot more authority than saying, well, economics says.
Oh, that's sad.
Yeah.
So, when you talk about the recovery being uneven, what's going to be uneven about it, do you think?
Well, I think the pace and also what recovers, right? So the pace is going to be driven completely by people's confidence in the news about the virus and whether we've got it under control and whether we have a vaccine and things like that. So we could see kind of several cycles of speeding up and slowing down. In terms of the breadth of it, you know, one of the things that's been really fascinating to me is seeing which industries have been affected in unexpected ways by the coronavirus, right? Some of the traditional industries that have traditionally fared poorly in recessions have done, you know, surprisingly well. I was reading the other day somewhere that the veterinarian industry is doing really well because everybody is locked down, and so they got pets, for example. You know, other things, of course, are pretty predictable, right? The travel industry has been hard hit, so I think there will be some really interesting and surprising pockets of recovery.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of the recovery, I mean, length of it.
I tend to agree with the folks who say that it's, you know, we're going to have this very, very prolonged recovery. To me, it's going to look a lot like the recovery from the global financial crisis in the sense it's going to take several years to get back to where we were in terms of overall output. The thing that we haven't touched on that I think is really tremendously important is the number of small businesses that have been absolutely destroyed by the lockdowns. And I just have no idea how we're going to replace those businesses and that level of employment. It's just, I think we're only beginning to understand the devastation that's being distributed around the country.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we're not really feeling the negative effects of the lockdown very much on business at all. There's like a delay, you know, like for instance, the trillions that were injected into the market by the Fed. I would think it's got to lead to inflation, but then again, there's not many places lately to spend your money. So
yeah, exactly. The inflation connection is really a big question mark, right? So you remember the Fed and all these other central banks in response to the global financial crisis did basically the same thing. They bought and bought and bought all kinds of bonds, and we didn't get inflation out of that because basically as in that case as well, there wasn't that much that businesses wanted to spend on, and so the money actually ended up back at the Fed because what happens is the bonds get purchased, the cash gets parked in the bank, and the bank basically turns it into reserve deposits at the Fed, and that's what's happening still so far. But really, it's like accumulating all of this dry powder. And the question as always is, you know, is something going to ignite the powder? So if we had really a dramatic turnaround, I think if we had a V-shaped recovery like some people were predicting back in March, that could actually ignite some serious inflation.
Yeah, I just wonder what's going to happen with the real estate market. Like that's still hot right now. I can't see that it would continue to be that way in an inflationary environment, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's a lot about what alternatives are out there, right? I think one of the things that's driving the equity market is the feeling that there are many other good alternatives in terms of investments, and I think that's helping real estate as well. That people are saying, well, you know, stocks are kind of risky, returns on bank deposits and bonds of all kinds are bad. Why don't I you know take another flyer on the housing market because you know people need to rent and the market seems to be doing pretty well in a lot of urban centers right now. You know, and that's bolstered, of course, by the low rates. So it seems like for a lot of people, it's another good time to start investing in houses. And you know, I'm even hearing stories about house flipping coming back.
Well, I guess what I'd worry about is, you know, there's things that would bolster the housing market, for instance. But if there's a moratorium on evictions, I haven't heard anything about foreclosures. Is there a moratorium on that? And is that hiding massive defaults, you know?
Yeah. So there is a moratorium on foreclosures if you have a government-backed mortgage. So if your mortgage has gone through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which does describe the vast majority of what they call conforming or kind of normal-sized mortgages, there is a moratorium on that. But you're right. There are definitely some, you know, people are missing several cycles of rent or mortgage payments, and there's only so much that the system can take, and it doesn't necessarily take a widespread breakdown of defaults and evictions to really have some bad economic consequences. So I agree with you that there's potentially looming danger there. I think the rental ecosystem, I think, is especially troubling. I think we tend to forget that there are a lot of individuals and a lot of small businesses that make their livelihood off of rental units, and I think that's really troubling because we don't know how leveraged a lot of these landlords might be.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how much of the market Airbnb rentals constitutes now, and that also has pretty much evaporated for a lot of places too.
Oh yeah,
so
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
another hidden weakness,
Yeah, absolutely, and that's going to hit especially certain urban centers where there have been a lot of Airbnbs, and a lot of people did do that kind of that kind of investment, buy an extra apartment or condo and put it up for Airbnb.
Yeah. Any other hidden weaknesses, like in terms of customer sentiment? I wonder, like for a while I thought I'm going to start hearing about bankruptcies more and more and more in the news. We started to, and then it's been quiet a little bit. But I just wonder at what point, if we're hearing about bankruptcies, let's say every single day, corporate ones, when it may be a sudden shift in sentiment and saying, we're in trouble,
Yeah, I think to me one of the important things is the difference between bankruptcy and liquidation. So bankruptcies are not necessarily bad. What's really troubling is when these bankruptcies lead to, the company's assets being sold and the stores being closed and sold off, and we are still seeing bankruptcies, especially in the retail space. There were kind of a fresh crop last week, but many of these bankruptcies are still. They're still trying to put off or avoid liquidation so that they're offering some hope that they might be able to get back on their feet. I think you're right. There could be a big overhang of all these companies that are going to be actually forced into liquidation. And one of the side effects, getting back to the broader financial markets and the Fed's activity, is that one of the worries of having the government buy companies' bonds is that it creates so-called zombie companies. I don't know if you remember the phrase they used that about the zombie banks back in the late 80s that were basically on government life support. But there's a worry that there could be a lot of companies out there in the U.S. economy that are taking advantage of low interest rates, generous purchases from the Federal Reserve to basically be on life support, and they can't contribute to growth. They just barely kind of limp along, and they're basically holding the economy back.
Why would they? I guess they're holding the economy back. What? Because they suck up government resources? Or?
Yeah, because they suck up resources and they don't grow. They're not going to be able to hire people back, right? If we want the economy to come back, we need businesses to take their employees back and even to do new investments and try to grow. The problem with zombie companies is that they're just floating along, trying to stay out of stay intact and not grow and not do anything new. There's a big problem with zombie companies in Europe, by the way. So one of the legacies of their government support from their previous financial crises is the creation of these so-called zombie companies, and so that provides a pretty stark object lesson there. And I think that's a lot of people are looking at. They're looking at the experience of countries like Italy, in which a lot of companies are still on kind of government life support, and worrying that we're creating that situation in the U.S. as well.
Has the government of Italy taken like equity stakes in these zombie companies, or are they just continuing to fund them and so they can exist? Yeah,
they're still basically trying to use government lending support to keep them going, and moral pressure on the banks to continue to lend. So they engage in a lot of what we call extend and pretend. You extend the terms of the loan and pretend that the customer's paying.
Oh. So I mean, instead of nationalizing an industry like the airlines, do you think maybe it's politically more favorable to make it into a zombie industry instead, then no one will complain as much?
Yeah, and especially it's because if you nationalize an industry, you basically have to come up with the money somewhere, somehow, and that's a big political challenge. The reason why we get all of these special government lending programs is that they're off the books pretty much. They're so-called off-balance sheet financing. And that's politically that works politically because you don't have to actually say that taxpayers' money is at risk, at least not directly.
So is there such a thing as a zombie industry? Has it gotten to that point with certain countries and industries?
Gosh, I wouldn't say so. A lot of people, expect certain industries to become zombies, but I don't know of any examples where that's really happened industry wide. There is a big question mark about retail in the U.S. and around the world. I mean, some folks might be saying that that's kind of a zombie industry. I don't think that's quite right. I think we are seeing some bright spots with certain types of retail, and it's about making the transition to both and it's what they call the multi-channel, making sure you can be there in person, but also handle the internet, the online stuff well.
Yeah, I don't see. Retail is like such a huge industry. I don't know. I don't see that.
Yeah,
but again, the airlines, maybe they could be a zombie industry, or maybe hotels.
Well, certainly the airlines are really highly cyclical. So they really all tend to fall at the same time, and it may be a case in which they all may need to be bailed out at the same time. And yeah, it really depends on what the long-term picture is for the recovery of the travel industry. You're right in that we could go through kind of a zombie phase, and the government would have to basically put its foot down and force some consolidation, especially in the U.S. where we still have multiple airlines. Although you also worry and wonder if we have too few airlines, what that's going to do to prices eventually.
Yeah, no, that's true. I don't know, so I guess going forward, what do you have one thought of how it will go? Do you have multiple thoughts? Are you thinking, I don't know, anything could happen? What kind of scenarios are you charting out, and do you have more than one in mind?
Yeah, I really think that multiple things could happen. I think, like I said a few minutes ago, I think it's I'm kind of disappointed in this, but I think consumer confidence and sentiment is so tied to news about the virus and about the vaccine that we're really going to be kind of dominated by that, and we're going to see these bumps and kind of bursts of activity when people are more optimistic about getting through this, and then it's going to retrench when people realize that the vaccine's still a ways away. I think really that, to me, that's the thing that's going to drive it, and I don't really know how we're going to get out of it. My hope, of course, is that we don't trigger any other types of problems. So some of the default and some of the hidden debt or hidden leverage problems that we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, if we get hit with that in addition, that could really trigger some real some even deeper recessions and some bigger problems for the economy.
And then, our relationship with China, do you think it's been a positive, this decoupling? Do you think it's a negative? Like, how do you think that's going to affect the dynamics of how the U.S. moves forward?
Yeah, I think that's been a real mixed bag. I think at the beginning of this year, when companies were basically thinking about their diversification of their production, I think that was a good idea to relocate some stuff out of China. I mean, the trade relationship for both countries has actually been, I think, on the whole, really good. It certainly is not perfect. There are certainly problems on both sides, and most people are familiar with what those things are. It just as a matter, now that the relationship between the two countries is really starting to get, for lack of a better expression, kind of nasty. I think that trade is not only important for what it does for the economies, but it's also something that keeps people's tempers from getting out of control. That we don't want to lose business, as well as we don't want to get mired in some kind of a, God forbid, some kind of an armed conflict. So I think it's good to diversify our economy a bit away from China, but they've got a lot of creative people. They've got a really great industrial base. It just doesn't make any sense in a lot of respects to try to completely get away and decouple from China. We do need to manage that relationship, and whether you like Trump or not, one of the things that he has done, I think that's been salutary, is basically calling attention to the fact that we can get tougher with China and get some results because of that.
How do you think China sees it?
Well, I think China is China's been very defensive. I think they see the U.S. as trying to thwart them from rising to the ranks of a superpower. So I think it's hard to extract that from kind of the economic side of it. So I find that, to me, that's a little bit troublesome because that means, everything that's economic is also automatically political and political in a really kind of conflict-driven way. So, yeah, I think the Chinese think that the U.S. is trying to stop them from developing and stop them from becoming, a strong country economically and politically, and the two are intertwined. So that I find, that's one of the things that really complicates this relationship and makes it so hard to manage.
Yeah, I remember being around for September 11th, and there was a lot of solidarity, but I don't see any solidarity now at all. With the coronavirus, it's like everyone for yourself.
Yeah.
We're not going to tell you what to do. Like if I'm the governor of the state, I've seen recently, we're not going to tell schools how to reopen. They'll do it themselves. And, the federal government said to the state governments, you do what you want in your state. We're not going to be involved. So economically, there is not much unity. How do you think that's going to play out in the U.S. and maybe worldwide? Because everyone seems to be just like, pulling in and into their shell and just hanging out alone.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you put your finger on something that's really important. You're right. The lack of unity is going to be another one of those things that's going to make the recovery that much slower. And to me, it gets back again to this idea of uncertainty. If the government would be able to tell us, and they should be able to tell us these days because they've got a whole bunch of data, where are we really at in terms of the so-called curve of the infections? One of the things that I would really love to know is the increase in infections this summer, is that kind of a normal part of going up the so-called curve, or is this something abnormal that we really should be panicking about? The government could do so much to calm people down and restore some of that unity by giving us all some better information that we could use to make better decisions. And I think it's a natural human response to try to take care of yourself in cases of really extreme uncertainty like this. And I think the government could reverse that and restore some more community spirit by giving us better information, and also like saying to people, look, it's part of your civic duty to go out and spend a little, because if everybody spends a little, then it'll put some people back to work.
Well, information, if I have information, it doesn't diminish your information.
Yeah.
Why is there no, people can complain, why doesn't the U.S. government provide guidance? Well, why doesn't the given state government provide guidance? Why doesn't any country in the world providing any guidance? I don't see anyone doing testing, let's say, on masks, every kind of mask, every kind of distance, every kind of circumstance, and providing data. Like everyone's like, we're going to wait for vaccines, but I don't see anyone saying, when the numbers change to this, that'll tell us that. When the numbers do this, okay, here's the progress. All I see is like, another person died. Things are increasing. We just don't know. There's no rational response. It's just like the media is like the one that's providing us the most quote unquote information is the media worldwide. Yeah. I don't see anyone stepping up to provide solid information. Nobody. I don't know why. It's strange.
Yeah, I find it strange also, and I think your point about masks and about rigorously testing masks is really spot on. They people claim that they protect, and they haven't really done the right tests or the amount of right tests. And I think it goes on and on. I mean, one thing that the government should be able to tell us these days is, just what is a rough estimate of what the true lethality of the virus. We don't even know, right? We're guessing about how lethal the virus is. Is it, does it kill 0.5% of the people that it infects? Is it more than that? Is it less than that? How is it relative to other diseases? You would think by now that we could get that information out. And that, to me, is really important information, because my personal view is that so many people are still living in fear that this virus, once they contract it, is going to be highly probable to kill them. And I just don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I just don't get it. Like if you look at Worldometer, there's 21 million cases approximately, and 16 million have recovered, and 1% are serious. And I don't hear a word about all the people that have recovered. I don't hear a word about, on a worldwide scale, it looks like 1% are serious and 99% are not. I just don't hear any of this stuff. And I don't understand if people have to worry about their economies, if the people that lead countries, one of their jobs is to keep the economy in good shape so their people don't fall into ruin.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't they take steps to clarify things and reduce uncertainty? I don't get it.
I agree with you. I think that's been a mystery to me as well. I think it was certainly at the very beginning of the pandemic when we're so concerned about the virus and didn't know that much about it. You want to make economic considerations secondary, but now 4 months into it, we're doing so much economic damage that we really need to be able to do reasonable cost benefits about all of our policies, and we really need to take into better account the tremendous economic cost that this is imposing on states, on localities, on individuals, and balance it off of really a much better, harder estimate of what the true medical benefit is.
Yeah, if it was just a U.S. phenomena, I can say, okay, it's the election or it's whatever, but it's not a U.S. phenomena. It's worldwide.
Yeah,
and everyone seems to be sitting there waiting for like some savior to come around. It just makes no sense.
Yeah, I find it really very ironic. In North Carolina where I live, it's hurricane season, and the contrast between the natural disaster that is a hurricane and the natural disaster that is the pandemic is really stark, because we can see the progress of both, and yet the hurricane people take precautions, but they know that they're not in control. They can't control the hurricane, and we don't even try. But we think somehow that we're in control of this of the virus, and we think that we can control its spread, and we think we can control the number of people who are going to get infected and die, and we can't, especially because the transmission is basically silent. So it's another thing that scratches. In my mind, it boils down to hubris. We think we can control this thing, and we're sadly mistaken.
Well, by looking at economics, do you see leaders? Are there certain countries that tend to lead with new economic strategies and follower countries?
Wow, that's a great question. There are lots of different countries doing all kinds of experiments all the time, and sometimes you hear about them and sometimes you don't. For example, I think one of the big experiments that has turned out really well was the experiment in Europe. I think it was really started in Germany during their global financial crisis, to basically have government support companies that would furlough workers and give them partial salaries rather than completely laying them off when there's a downturn. And that has really cushioned the blow for a lot of companies, and it's kept the relationship between the employer and the employee so they can come back to work really quickly. In the US, if you have people who get laid off, they basically have to go and reapply for their jobs in many cases. And so I think that policies like that, we see the World Laboratory, and we can learn some lessons for that. It would be nice if the US would, instead of having to have a short-term extension of unemployment benefits that has to be renewed in Congress every so often, we think about, could we design a furlough policy like that might be actually less expensive and more effective at getting people back to work.
Well, then there's the $600 over current unemployment number, which I've heard was a fixed number because the government's computers aren't up to snuff to have it variable. Is there any credence to that?
I think there is. I think there's a lot of old equipment in the government. And one of the problems was actually even just distributing the money. And again, it gets back to IT problems as well as anything else. There are that affects businesses as well in the U.S., but it certainly affects the government. If they don't get the appropriations to buy new IT stuff, then they're stuck with the old standards, and it sounds like they've been stuck with the old standards for quite a while. That's a problem also, at the Federal Reserve. They're trying to modernize our payment system so that we can transmit payments, instantaneously and literally catch up with the rest of the world in terms of how we shop and how we pay each other. And part of their problem is IT as well. We have antiquated IT that's worked, it's worked really well for a long, long time, but maybe it's time to upgrade that stuff.
So, Connell, how are you going to single-handedly make change here and help the world? What's your idea going forward?
Well, I'm going to do what I can to support my local economy, get out and try to spend a little bit of money, and I'm going to focus on trying to educate the next generation of future consumers and leaders, and try to help those folks do a better job at figuring stuff out. Happy to give advice, but. That's really I think really that's my role, is teaching and writing and trying to give some advice and trying to tell people what I think, and hopefully convince folks that there's some reason to it.
And what's the best way to find out more about your work and get in touch?
Well, you can find me online in the economics department. You can look me up through Duke University or through the Great Courses. I have several courses on financial markets and economics, especially the economics of uncertainty, out through Great Courses. That's a great place to find me. I'm happy to respond to people's emails as long as I got the time, and that's really the best way to get a hold of me.
Okay. Well, Connell, thanks for coming. I appreciate your willingness to speculate. Very few are willing to do that. So thank you very much.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I really have enjoyed our chat.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.